Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this BASW webinar to launch our revised Code of Ethics. My name is Martin Sexton. I'm the chair of BASW's Policy, Ethics and Human Rights Committee, and I'm going to be kind of overseeing proceedings today with support from my colleagues. We're going to start with a brief message from the BASW chair, Jerry Nosowska. Unfortunately, Jerry's not able to join the webinar in person, but she's recorded a message for us. And so we'll now go over to what Jerry has to say.
Hello, my name is Jerry Nosowska and I'm the chair of the British Association of Social Workers. I'm delighted that BASW is holding this event to launch our revised Code of Ethics. We are really fortunate that social work is a global profession and our practice doesn't depend on where we happen to work, but is underpinned by international learning and experience and global ethics of human rights, social justice and professional integrity. BASW is proud to be the United Kingdom representative to the International Federation of Social Workers, and we are proud to live up to global social work values in our Code of Ethics.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Now going to introduce you to Dr. Ruth Allen, who is the Chief Executive of BASW, who's going to give us some more perspective on the code and its importance for BASW as an organisation. So over to you, Ruth. Okay, so thank you very much for those contributions. I'm going to move on now to a presentation from Sarah Banks, who's a professor in the Department of Sociology at Durham University. For those of you who are not familiar with Sarah, she's an authority, a well-respected authority on professional ethics and social work ethics in particular. She's the author of Ethics and Social Values in Social Work, which is now its 5th edition. We're absolutely delighted that she's produced this presentation for us, about 20 minutes long. Where she'd be talking about ethics in general, social work ethics in particular, and the ongoing relevance of codes of ethics and statements of ethics. So we're now going to move to Sarah.
Hello, I'm delighted to be offering you a presentation today on the occasion of the launch of the refreshed BASW Code of Ethics. I'm only sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'm sure you will have a very interesting session and discussion. The theme of my talk is reinvigorating social work ethics. And I'd like to raise with you a couple of questions which will frame the presentation. The first is a question given to me by Jane Shears when I gave a talk for BASW in August of 2020, and she gave me the title, Can Social Work Ethics Survive a Global Pandemic? And I was a little bit taken aback by that title because it seemed very negative, but I warmed to it, and so I'd like to thank Jane for that because it's a provocative title, and of course it did reflect the kinds of thoughts and feelings that were going on early in the pandemic. We'd been doing an international survey with the International Federation of Social Workers, and many of the respondents were telling us that they couldn't act ethically. It was very difficult. This is a Chinese social worker saying it felt like we were at war, and in a war situation you just get on, you do the job, you haven't got time to stop, reflect and think, is this right? You just do it. And a British social worker talked about it feeling like she was doing antisocial social work, so social work that was almost like the opposite of what it should be. However, in doing the talk last year, I flipped the question round to ask, can social work survive a global pandemic without an ethical compass? And I think that was also a question that was reflected in the responses to the survey, as we found that although it was very difficult for social workers to act ethically, they were working incredibly hard to do the right thing in very, very challenging circumstances. And another UK social worker talked about the need for ethical vigilance, that she needed to be even more aware and sensitive of all the possible ethical dimensions, risks, rights, responsibilities, much more so than in normal times. So a very difficult time for social work, but also a time when we can probably learn quite a lot about our ethics and values. Social work ethics, I'm using the term in a singular sense to mean a topic or a body of values and principles. It can also be used in a plural sense to mean the actual values and principles. So social work ethics is based on professional values, principles, and standards relating to human rights, social justice, and professional integrity. And those are the main headings of the BASW Code. If we go back to that first question, which would suggest that social work ethics is redundant, we might say, are we in an era of post-ethics, beyond ethics, in pandemic conditions when usual routines are unavailable and there's no time to think, do we have to just forget the ethics and get on with the job? In an era of post-truth and fake news, when honesty and integrity don't seem to matter, is ethics irrelevant? It sometimes seems like that. In a neoliberal and managerialist context where the economic ends often justify the means, is acting ethically impossible? So quite a challenge for us. However, we can't take this lying down. What I think we need, and probably you will all agree, is a reinvigorated ethics. Social work ethics is actually more important than ever to help us rethink, recalibrate, reset our values and principles for new circumstances. Some of you who are familiar with the work of the International Federation of Social Workers will have noticed it, along with the UN and various other bodies, has been talking about a new eco-social world, tying in the climate crisis with the pandemic to argue for a new global solidarity. And indeed, the theme of World Social Work Day, or month, as BASW had it, was Ubuntu, the African philosophy, I am because we are. It's also important for us to call out politicians, other professionals, organizations, if they're lying and if they are undertaking exploitative practices, and to resist injustices, crass utilitarianism and disrespect of human rights. So social work ethics is, I think, more important than ever. So it's very timely that BASW has refreshed the Code of Ethics, taking the time to review and reiterate our values and ethical principles, to reconsider why they're important, and to rethink how we can put them into practice in pandemic and other challenging conditions. And there's some pictures on the side there of a few of the past BASW codes of ethics, including at the back there a very battered photocopy of the Code of Ethics from Social Work Today in 1975, the first Code of Ethics. Codes of ethics are, I think, important. They're multi-purpose, they take many forms, and they are often misunderstood. So I'll just go through each of these in turn. They're important for professions. I think we all know this. Externally, they're a public statement of commitment to the core purpose and values of the profession. They're a statement about trustworthiness and credibility of practitioners, and we certainly need that more than ever. Internally, they help create and maintain professional identity, who we are, what we do, and also generate ethical dialogue and guidance about what to consider when facing ethical challenges and dilemmas. They are multi-purpose, so they don't just have one purpose. Some of these purposes may be hidden, some of them are overt and stated in the preambles to the codes. We've already mentioned public credibility. They contribute to professional status because all professions need to have a code of ethics and professional identity. They also contain often aspirations for the profession. Sometimes they're looking at the ideals, the guiding ideals of the profession, this ideal of a socially just world, for example, which may not be achievable in the short term, but is an aspiration for social work to contribute towards that. And they provide guidance for professionals, sometimes detailed guidance, sometimes more principle-based guidance. They are there to protect people who need or use services by ensuring that social workers practice in an ethically fair way. And in some cases, not in the case of the BASW Code, they're used to discipline and regulate professionals. In England, we have the Social Work England, and there's other regulatory bodies in the other countries of the UK which do the regulation, and they have their own standards against which professionals are regulated. But certainly in many countries of the world, particularly those that don't have statutory regulatory bodies, then the codes of ethics of the professional associations can be used for the purpose of regulation. They take many formats. You're probably familiar with the fact that the first code of ethics took the form of an oath, the Hippocratic Oath. Most of those in social work have disappeared, but we have a new one in the form of an oath from the Iran Association of Social Workers. And this code actually starts off, it's called the Iranian Social Workers Oath, and it starts off in the name of God. I, as a professionally skilled social worker, promise to take on board the principles of the Social Workers Manifesto and serve honestly the people, etc. And that is just about a page and a half expressing a commitment to be a certain kind of person. Quite a lot of codes across the world are shorter, with some general ethical principles and some practice and principles, and the BASW Code is a good example of that. We are also seeing an increasing number of longer codes with not only principles, but also more detailed standards and rules telling you what to do in particular circumstances. And the USA is a model of this, and Australia has now overtaken them in terms of the length of the document. The document from Australia is over 50 pages long. The USA code has 172 standards or substandards, including 23 on the theme of confidentiality, going into levels of detail, for example, about privacy, not discussing private information in elevators and hallways and restaurants, for example. So a very great deal of specificity there. Because they're multi-purpose and multi-formatted, codes can mean different things to different people and are often misunderstood. And there's various criticisms of codes, and as you will guess, they don't all apply to all codes. So one critique which could be applied to the BASW Code is that they're too general. They don't offer specific guidance. They don't tell us what we should do if we find ourselves having to share confidential information in a garden, for example. On the other hand, they have been criticized for being too specific, encouraging mindless rule following and getting lost in specifying all possible situations. And that is a criticism that could be leveled at the Australian and USA codes, for example. Once you start on this trend of listing restaurants, hallways, and elevators, then you have to think about, well, okay, let's add in, is a garden okay or not? What about a parking lot, etc. Another critique is that they're too idealistic, presenting social workers as heroic saviors. I don't think the BASW Code does that, but all codes do have idealistic tendencies, inevitably, because we're looking to do practice that is anti-oppressive, fair, promoting social justice in a world where these things are not necessarily present or likely to be in the medium term. One of the most interesting codes in this respect was a previous version of the Swedish code, which had words to the effect of wheresoever in the world injustice exists, social workers have a duty to challenge it. So that sort of suggested the social workers as a kind of flying angels going around the world trying to make things better. So there is a tendency for that. Another critique is that codes are too top-down, imposed by an external authority, and therefore they're not taken on board in the hearts, minds of the practitioners themselves. In the case of the BASW Code, I hope it doesn't feel like that, because BASW is a membership organization, and the earlier version of the code, of which this is a refreshment, was very heavily consulted upon, and of course BASW members contribute to the wording and the way in which it is used, but there is a danger that it seems like that. They're also criticised for being too individual focused, stressing social worker responsibility rather than structural constraints. And in fact, that is the essence of what they are. They are about what responsibilities does a social worker have, but it is important that these are set in the context of a world which is full of poverty, inequality, issues and problems that are not of the social worker's making, and therefore the social worker needs to raise those issues and not take responsibility for solving all the problems of the world, but making a contribution to that mission. And finally, they're often criticised for being too fossilized, like a tablet of stone. And this is particularly because they are equated with a written document, that this is the Code of Ethics, this document that we have here, whereas we could perhaps see it as a living tradition, embodied by its practitioners and embedded in everyday practice. So in our very demeanor, the way we look at people, talk to people, the processes and procedures we use all have ethics embodied and embedded within them. And we need to recognize that, and that's part of the code. The code is there in our bodies and our hearts and our minds and our practices. And the code could also be considered as an ongoing dialogue in a community of practitioners. And I'm quoting here from Dennis Rice, who worked at the University of Leicester, from Social Work Today in 1975 on the occasion of the launch of the first code, where he talked about an association of professional social workers as a community of consultation and mutual monitoring. And the code creates a spirit and standard of ethical reflection in that community of ideals, skills, and practical concern. And I think that's a really important point, the spirit and standard of ethical reflection. Dennis Rice also went on to say that a code attempting detailed guidance would be no code, it would be unworthy of the name ethics and would be for mindless children, not adult professionals. I think we might frame that slightly differently today, but we get the point that he's making. If the BASW Code doesn't tell us what to do in particular circumstances, how does it help in everyday practice, let alone in pandemic conditions? Well, I think it's a reminder of who we are and what our core values are. It highlights important ethical issues for consideration, such as dignity, confidentiality, fairness. It provides a vocabulary in which to articulate these issues, and it can be used to justify actions, call out bad practice, and challenge employers and policymakers when we need to. And I will now just give an example of an everyday ethical challenge that happened during COVID-19 last year that was contributed by a UK social worker when we did the international survey. And he was a therapeutic social worker working with a 15-year-old woman, Lisa, who lived in a local authority residential home. She had experience of domestic violence. She realized this caused her difficulties in regulating emotions, and to manage her anger, she'd often go for a walk. And the social worker said, following the first lockdown in the UK, walking was restricted to once per day. The young people in the home were advised if they left unauthorised, they were likely to be arrested by police. The local authority policy was to ensure young people firmly adhered to stay-at-home advice. Lisa complained she needed to leave the home for a walk on the odd occasion she felt anger rising. She cited the fact that staff in the home usually went with her or encouraged her to do so and was therefore upset this couldn't take place. I, said the social worker, agreed with Lisa's position. She needed to go for a walk outside when she felt herself getting angry and communicated with the team manager about Lisa's concerns. So what does the code say about this? The code can't tell us what to do in this situation, but the code has relevant principles which may guide our thinking. In the section on human rights, there's a principle about upholding and promoting human dignity and well-being. And it talks about working towards promoting the best interests of individuals and groups in society in the avoidance of harm. So that's telling us we've got to think of the best interests, not only of Lisa, but also of the other people living in the home and the general public. The second principle is respecting the right to self-determination. So social workers respecting, promoting people's dignity and rights to make their own decisions and choices, provided this doesn't threaten the rights, safety and legitimate interests of others. Social workers ensure that any limitations on a person's rights are necessary and proportionate and are for a legitimate purpose. And that last sentence is actually a new sentence, and it's quite important, I think, in Lisa's case. Finally, another principle is challenging unjust practices and policies, and that's been there from the very beginning, from the 1975 code, although slightly differently worded. Social workers are expected to bring to the attention of their employers, policymakers, politicians, and the general public situations where resources are inadequate and or policies and practices are oppressive, discriminatory, or otherwise unfair, harmful, or illegal. So that helps us think about the policy of only leaving the home once a day and whether that is unfair, harmful, etc. So these principles suggest questions we might ask about what are Lisa's best interests, her rights, who else's rights, interests and safety are at stake. Is a limitation on Lisa's rights to walk and indeed the other residents more than once a day necessary and proportionate? Is the local authority policy and the residential home practice oppressive, discriminatory, otherwise unfair? Should the social worker challenge the policy? If so, how and with whom? And in fact, the social worker did challenge the blanket policy with the residential home manager and the local authority, and he made a case in writing. And he made the case actually not just for Lisa, but for all looked after children, talking about the fact that often they were being looked after because they had difficult home circumstances, they were having challenging emotions, and therefore a blanket policy did not seem fair or just. And so then that was reconsidered. So that's just a very small example, as I said, of everyday practice and the relevance of the code and the way in which we can think through in relation to some of those principles. And one question I would like to leave you with, having looked at those first two questions, and I think come to the view that we definitely need an ethical compass to get through the pandemic, and that the code is a very useful means of doing that. What does the Code of Ethics mean for you? How do you relate to it? How do you use it? How could you use it differently? And if any of you are interested in any of the literature that we've produced, we've been working with BASW on pulling out the responses from the British social workers from the international survey to the report on that. We've produced a resource. We've produced a report with IFSW and some ethical guidance, an article in international social work, and finally, a new edition of the textbook Ethics and Values in Social Work is out, which has an updated chapter on codes of ethics and is published in the the BASW Practical Social Work series. So I would like to wish you well for the rest of the conference or the event, and again, I'm sorry not to be there, but hope the rest of the session goes well. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you. Thanks again to Sarah for that fascinating, stimulating and encouraging presentation. And hopefully we'll come back to some of those ideas in the question and answer session. I'm now happy to bring in Ruth Allen. I think Ruth had some technical issues earlier. Ruth is the Chief Executive of BASW. So Ruth is going to give us her perspective on the new code.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, I'm sorry. The technology crashed completely unexpectedly. I'm very pleased to be joining you and to launch this refresh of our Code of Ethics. And actually, I'm speaking now having had the benefit of hearing from Sarah and how she has really encouraging us to really bring alive the Code of Ethics. Our Code of Ethics is a truly foundational document for us as an association and, of course, for social work across the UK, rooted in long-held principles of human rights, social justice, evidence-informed practice, and the values that underpin our purpose as a profession. It also needs to be and to feel absolutely relevant to the challenges of social work and society today. Just as Sarah was saying, it needs to feel practical and to use language that helps us in social work every day. It's not guidance, it's not a how-to, but it should nonetheless feel like it has really practical relevance when we're considering particularly those thorny, knotty ethical issues, which are everyday experiences for social workers. So in this context, I'm really pleased we've refreshed the code. Thanks to all who've been involved in it, particularly Martin, for steering this through our Policy, Ethics and Human Rights Committee and through BASW Council. And this is a refresh and not a rewrite. That wasn't needed. Our Code of Ethics was strong, but you'll be hearing today, you've already heard today, some of the key ways in which we've updated elements, not least to reflect the updates in global ethical principles from the International Federation, including more comment on social media and the ethics of our digital world, and focusing more on inclusivity and anti-oppression. Code is written in plain language, and that too I think is vital. Expressing powerful and important ideas in ways that are easy to digest is a social work skill, and I think this version of the Code of Ethics achieves that. Living through COVID has affected us all, again, as Sarah has already covered. It's exposed huge inequalities in our societies across the UK and created as well many practical difficulties for social workers trying to meet people's needs, uphold their rights and entitlements, and it's created great ethical challenges. Having the Code of Ethics has been crucial throughout this time. It's been crucial for me in my role, and it's guided BASW's actions to support social workers and promote good practice, and helped us inform governments, inform governmental actions and decisions throughout the crisis across the UK, for instance, including influencing the ethical guidance for adult social care during COVID in England from the Department of Health and Social Care. I believe we can do more to promote the Code of Ethics, and again I refer to Sarah's presentation there about ideas about how we can do that and bring it even more alive for social workers and social work organisations. We will be doing this, and if you have any ideas about how we can connect social workers more with the code so that you and your colleagues can use it to feel more supported and informed in dealing with everyday ethical issues, we would love to hear from you about that. So thank you. I'm very pleased to be here to welcome the new code, and back to you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Thanks for that. Yes, I mean, I'd like to re-stress what Ruth has said about the value of the code in the most recent times and the strong basis it's given us to respond to the challenges that we faced and that our members have faced. And I'll be saying a little bit more about that in due course. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just summarize the changes that have been made to the code, put it in the context of what a Code of Ethics is and why BASW has one, why BASW thinks it needs one. So this will overlap a bit with what Sarah said, but I'll go on to and we'll give you a more BASW perspective. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. What is a Code of Ethics? Why does BASW have a code? Why has the code been revised? What are the main changes? How will the code be developed in the future? Okay, Lisa, next slide, please. Okay, so what is a code of ethics? Well, you know, I can't begin to compare with the excellent exposition that Sarah's given us, but for this is what it is, I think, for me and for people who use it in the organisation. It's a statement of core values and principles, statement of focusing social work on human rights, social justice, and the importance of how social workers behave and how they present themselves. It's a key proponent of professional identity. It enables us to identify what social work is, who social workers are, when we can say that looks like good social work practice, or actually no, that doesn't look like good social work practice. And it's also a commitment to accountability. It's a public document. We don't keep it secret. We post it on our website and we say, this is who we're trying to be. This is what we think social work is. This is who we think the kinds of people social workers should be. So if that's not your experience of social work, then you have the right to call us out on it. You have the right to challenge it. So I think that that's an important function that a code performs, as well as the obvious ones about professional identity and committing to values and principles. Okay, next slide, please, Lisa. So again, picking up on some of the points that Sarah raised, this is what a code of ethics isn't. At least not as far as BASW was concerned. Other organisations take different views, but BASW's approach is it's not a list of answers to every ethical question, and it's not a detailed how to do social work in every possible conceivable context. This is because it's a statement for all our members who are practicing in a wide range of fields, in a wide range of circumstances, and have different levels of responsibilities. Some of our members are directing the social services departments of the organisations they work for. So it's got to work for everyone. And it's not intended to eliminate disagreement. Reasonable people who've got good reasons for believing what they believe will always disagree about things. But what this code does do is place some constraints on what can be disagreed on if you're still going to be doing social work, and how you should express that disagreement. And I think that that's particularly relevant, obviously, in a digital age, in the social media age, as how we express ourselves, even when we feel very strongly about things. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. We're not practicing in a vacuum. There are other things that constrain practice or that guide practice, legislation and regulation. And I think, you know, Sarah said something about that. And I think my take on this is that legislation affects everyone. The law is the law. Everyone's bound by the law, including social workers. Regulation is often a tricky point as to the extent to how much social workers have actually had input into the regulation that they face. That's an issue in England at the moment and in other places. But that's all about legislation and regulation. Is about setting minimum standards. It's about setting the floor, if you like. Below this, we can't go. And I think the Code of Ethics is about social workers setting standards for themselves and setting high standards for themselves and aspiring to acting in the best possible way, the most ethical way, challenging oppression when we see it, recognizing that we won't always meet those standards, but that's our aspiration for ourselves. It might be okay for the regulator to say, well, that's good enough social work, and we say, well, no, we want to go further, we want to do more. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so why does BASW have a code of ethics? What's it for? What does it do? These are the things I think it does. It's obviously a vital resource for our practice. It helps us, it guides us. What are we doing? What should we be doing? What should other people be doing? So framing ethical issues, not providing answers to every question, but identifying and framing that there's an issue of right and wrong here, and how to ask questions of it and of the situation and of ourselves. As has been mentioned before, obviously we've had a crisis this year, a worldwide crisis, to which BASW's had to respond. But we all have crises in our own lives, our professional lives, and we need guidance fast. We need something to turn to that we can rely on, and hopefully that's what the Code of Ethics is. And certainly my experience from working with the association over the last 18 months, trying to help our members respond to the COVID crisis, everything we did was firmly rooted in our code, and it passed the test. I think it helped. It really did genuinely help us. We had to think hard about how to apply it in very strange and unprecedented situations, but we were able to use it and to provide guidance for our members. The feedback which we've had has been very positive, although obviously we need to keep it refreshed and keep it alive to what's happening. And then it guides BASW's policy work more generally, which Ruth has alluded to, with presenting the voice of social work in public policy debate, promoting social justice, challenging public measures that contravene the values that we hold and that we think are going to be harmful for the people that we're trying to support and for our members, and the code is a vital resource for that. I think the code also helps us communicate what social work is, what it's for, what it does, who social workers are. As I said, there's an accountability dimension to that, which is important. But I think there's also something there about opening up social work for people to better understand what it is, what it offers, what it might offer them. Is it a potential career for that person? I think having a clear statement of principles and values is something that's very valuable in those contexts. And obviously, once somebody's made the decision to become a social worker and retrain, to take that path, then they will want to develop themselves at different stages of their career in different directions. And the code is a constant resource for those developments and the different opportunities that BASW tries to give its members, and hopefully will be a resource for other people to draw on. I think this is how we should be encouraging people to do social work. And it's a safeguard. It's a safeguard for practitioners who can say, well, I'm a member of a professional association. I'm bound by my association's code of ethics, and I'm concerned about what you're asking me to do or what you're doing to these people that I'm trying to support or these other people in this situation. And so it's an important resource for when we are challenged or when we are challenging others, because conflict can get very difficult, it can get emotional, it can get personal, and a code of ethics, as Sarah talked about, having a vocabulary, is a way of presenting these issues, presenting these questions in a more objective way, an evidence-based way that takes some of the personalities and heat out of the situation. Say, look, there's some vital principles at play here, and they constrain what we can do and what we can't do in a situation. Next slide, please. Okay, so why have we revised the code? What's been the occasion for it? We've heard some of the reasons why. Obviously, a code has to be a living document. It has to be a living thing, as Sarah said. It's not just a piece of paper in the drawer or something on the website. It's got to be alive and meaningful and responsive, and that means that it needs refreshing every now and again. The global organization, the International Federation of Social Work, recently revised its code of practice, code of ethics, sorry. BASW is affiliated to Ifsw, so our code needs to track their code. It doesn't have to reproduce it word for word, but it does need to be consistent with it and to draw on the ideas and ideals that it contains. So that was the starting point, but it then gave us an opportunity to do a number of other things, to think about the relevance of the code and the application of the code to some new situations, particularly around social media and digital technology. And inevitably, when a document of this sort has a lifespan, when you return to it after a period of time, you think, well, we can express things better than that, or we need to include other things. We need to change the wording here because it's not clear, or people might feel left out. They might not see their own concerns reflected in that phrasing, so we need to change it. So it's been through throughout the BASW structure, been through a number of different elements of the structure. Jane, the Ifsw Ethics Commissioner, has been strongly involved in connecting the new draft to the Ifsw code. It's been to PHR, the committee that I chair. BASW's new Equality, Diversity, Inclusion group has also been involved. National standing committees have looked at it with their member-led, elected member representation, and finally been approved recently by BASW Council. Next slide, please. So what are the main changes? Well, as we've said, it's not a rewrite. We're not changing the basic value base of social work in human rights, social justice, human dignity, and professional integrity. The Ifsw code is still based on those principles, so the BASW code remains based firmly on those principles. But there have been some changes to the Ifsw code. They've strengthened their commitment mainly through just changing phrasing, really, to anti-oppressive practice, going beyond, making it clear that social work has to go beyond the legislative and regulatory minimum, and for this to be an active commitment for social workers. Obviously, this change predates the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, but I think that just shows the need for social work and other professions across society to really have a very firm active commitment to challenging oppression, and that needs to be reflected in their code. The other main change in the Ifsw code, which I mentioned here, is social work across social media, social work across digital platforms, social workers using digital technology, social workers expressing themselves on social media, and what are the core principles of the profession govern those activities as well, and that needs to be made clear to social workers and to others that you're still practicing social work if you're communicating in that way as a social worker, and your practice and your language should conform to the values of your profession. I think in our particular BASW Code of Ethics, I think there's some other issues that are more clear now. I think that we've taken the opportunity to include more references to social workers reflecting on their own practice, especially in sections of the code where maybe the overall thrust of the code is social workers being expected to challenge things or to call things out or to challenge oppression. And we've recognised, well, we need to recognise that we behave in these ways as well at times, and we need to accept reflection on our practice as an ethical responsibility. It's not simply a functional thing. It's an ethical thing. It's part of what practicing ethically means to reflect and say, yeah, I didn't do the best I could there, and this is what I think I need to do to do better the next time. I think we've now got a few more references for clarity around how social work applies to people who are unable to make decisions for themselves, who lack the mental capacity to make decisions. I think we're now in a situation where all of the 4 nations have relevant legislation in this area, Northern Ireland being the most recent to pass its own Mental Capacity Act. So it's important to pick out those areas in the code where this is going to be a particular issue, and social workers need to bear it in mind. And as I've said, we've done a tidy up, rephrasing. When you come back to these codes, you always find that you could express things better, or there's a bit of repetition, or things are not clear. And so we've tried to do that. Hopefully we have, but we will inevitably have to revisit the text in the future to see how we're doing and see if it's still doing the job that it needs to do. So next slide, please, Lisa, which I think is the last one. Okay, so that's where we've got to. You have the code in your handout pack. I hope you find it useful. You find it something in there to inspire you, to make you think, to make you reflect. But it has to be a living thing. It can't just be a piece of paper or link on a website. Ruth has already given us some ideas as to how we can make it live, how we need to make it live. It's already the basis of other BASW policy documents, so the vision for social work that we published recently, our practice guide on social work and human rights that we published a couple of years ago, and the guidance that we're providing members on working in partnership with non-BASW members, and that can be ongoing partnerships, or it can be promoting an event, or doing something on social media, and helping people relate the code to how they work with other people, and also to remind them, if it's a BASW event, then the event has to reflect BASW's Code of Ethics. People outside the event might have different views, but once they're in an event that BASW's engaged with, then our code is what needs to regulate what happens. We want to engage with yourselves, with members, to find out what you think about the code. Think about those questions that Sarah posed. How do you use it? How could you use it? What do you think you could do differently? What could BASW do differently? Where are any areas where you think that BASW could be really using its code to produce statements of good practice, of ethical practice? Obviously, if the Ifsw code changes, then we will be tracking changes to the code. We will be going through a similar process in the future when we need to do that, and responding to things that happen. The last time the BASW Code was refreshed, nobody could have imagined, or very few people could have imagined, a global pandemic like COVID. The code has been tried and tested during this process, but I think we need to continue that process of reflection. And the next challenge we face may who knows, it may take us beyond what the thinking we've already done, and we may need to go further. And if we do that, we will do that through dialogue, through consultation, and respecting the contributions and the expertise of all of our members. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that that's clarified some questions that you might have had around why we need to refresh the code and what the new refreshed code is about. I'm happy to be able to welcome Luke Gagan now. Luke is the head of the policy team at BASW, and we've got about 15 minutes now for questions and answers. So please do include the questions in the chat. They'll be fed through to Luke and myself. I think it's unlikely we'll have time to answer them all, but it's very useful to us, to all of us, to know what concerns you have, what ideas you have. So even if we're not able to answer your specific question, it will be noted, and we will be thinking about it. So Luke, over to you. Where are we starting?
Hello, everybody. My job is just to kind of feed through the questions to Martin, so he's not in the position of asking the question and then answering it himself. We've got questions coming through. The first question is, Martin, you mentioned how the Code of Ethics was really helpful in navigating BASW through the pandemic in relation to the policy and guidance that we produced, especially over last summer at the height of the lockdown. Can you give us some specific examples of that and how it influenced you?
Thank you very much. Yes. Well, obviously it was a huge challenge, to put it mildly, in lots of ways for everyone. And I think that BASW very rapidly wanted to support its members as best as it could through this very challenging time. And I think became conscious quite soon that no one else was really stepping up to provide guidance to social workers on how they should respond. So it was not something that BASW not just wanted to do, but felt it had to do to support its members. I was part of a small subgroup of the Policy, Ethics and Human Rights Committee that we met. The committee itself normally meets quarterly, but we were meeting weekly at one point to look at what was happening, what was the issues that were emerging, what the government was telling us we should do, what the social work response should be. And I think that we obviously turned to the Code of Ethics, and we looked at its very clear commitment to human rights, social justice. We could see very, very quickly that there were obviously implications for those values in what was happening, that people were going to be subject to significant degrees of restriction, that social workers were going to have different expectations placed on them, and that there was a real risk of inequality and injustice in the way that those provisions were applied. And I think that's what we saw. We've seen that in practice. We've seen the evidence for that this illness doesn't affect all social groups equally, doesn't affect all social workers equally. And so we very quickly decided that we need to put out a strong statement reaffirming those values, because we could see that they would be put under pressure. And we also we thought it was important to affirm what social workers were doing as citizens, not just as professionals, but as people responding to the challenge, and using our core values to frame that response, but then having to think really hard about how can we make it relevant, how can we make it realistic and meaningful in a situation under which we're under so much pressure. I think that guidance that we produced right at the beginning, although lots of things have happened since then, and we've been through lots of developments and lots of sadness and pain and loss for lots of people, I think that guidance has stood the test of time. That it's focusing on the social workers as people and also as professionals. Well, what's the what should they be expecting of themselves? What should they be expecting of the people that are they're working with, they're working for, who are managing them? And social workers have rights in this situation as well. So it's you know, we've seen an example in Sarah's presentation of people speaking up for the people that they're working with who are maybe not being treated fairly, even though there's a need to protect everyone. And also the social workers themselves getting access to protective equipment and so on. So I think that it was a challenge. It wasn't simply a case of us going to the Code of Ethics and saying, "Ah, there's the answer." It was a case of us going to the code and saying, "Well, those are the things that we really want to affirm in this situation, and we will use our expertise in this group to advise BASW Council on what we do." We get feedback from our members, and the feedback, we've had lots of feedback from members throughout the pandemic, which has been great, and lots of ideas. But that feedback has said, you know, this guidance is what we need. This is what we should be saying as social workers, and this is how we should be trying to practice in this situation.
Great, thank you for that. Lots of questions coming in. I'm not sure we're going to be able to deal with all of them, but here's the next one. Learning, co-production, service users, obviously key. What does the Code of Ethics say about, you know, partnership working with service users generally?
I think it stresses the importance throughout of working with other people. The social worker is there to listen, to understand, to appreciate, to understand what's important to the individuals in that situation, and to enable them, as far as the social worker is able to do it, they've got resources to do it, to express themselves, to live the life that they want to live, that they're seeking to live. I think you know, it's something that threads throughout the code. You know, that we at the beginning we've got the principles promoting people to participate in what's happening in their lives, what's happening around them, to be empowered to make decisions, to work holistically, to look at the whole person, to respect people's right to self-determination. And then when people are disadvantaged in those situations, when there are imbalances of power, and when there's inequality and oppression, that the social worker is there as an ally to support the person, to support them in challenging that and claiming their rights, and supporting them to get better outcomes in their lives. So I think that that we could have a whole webinar, I think, on that subject, because it's throughout the code of practice. I think there are bits that are specifically about it, but then the whole tenor, the whole basis of the code really is to promote that way of working and that way of being in the world with people. So I know we will be using the code, different aspects of it, in our ongoing work with people who use social work, who have experience of social work, to inform what the organisation does and the positions that it's lobbying for in the future.
Great. And the next question is, I'm a newly qualified social worker. I want to practice ethically. What should I do?
I think that it's great that you've identified that as a commitment that you need to make. I think that it's really important to do that, but you can't really get into the ethics of a situation unless you recognise that there are questions of right and wrong and better and worse, and you should be trying to find the best answers that you can. So it's great that you've identified that. I think I would share that with your practice teachers and your supervisors, to say, you know, if you're a BASW member, to say, I'm a BASW member, this is my code of ethics, this is how I'm going to go about what I do, this is what I'm going to draw on in my reflection when I'm preparing my work and my portfolios. If I'm on the ASYE course, I'm going to explicitly draw on the code to guide my practice and to guide my reflection on on what I'm doing, and I expect you to support me, because that's what good social work looks like. And it's difficult for everybody to practice in the way that they would ideally want to, but I think it's really great that you've made that upfront commitment, and I'd make that commitment to your supervisors and your tutors, and ask their support, and you should get it. And if you don't, then you have a problem, because you should be getting that support. You should be getting that recognition that it's a good thing to have a set of ethical principles, even if the people who are supporting you are not BASW members. They ought to respect that. They ought to respect that you are, and that's how you're going to develop your practice, and you should be supported to do that. And if you're not getting that support, then come and talk to BASW. Come and talk to the organisation, and we will help you as best we can. But yeah, I think that you've already done the most important thing, which is to say this has to be an upfront, explicit commitment, and other people should be aware of it and should respect it.
Great. And I've got my eye on the clock. I think we've got time for one more question. I'm not sure I actually understand this one, Martin, but I think it's about social media.
Right.
And the question says, people in general seem to be taking a very different approach to what is private and personal and what is personal and public. What are the implications for the social work approach to confidentiality? You've got 3 minutes.
Good. Okay. Well, again, we could do another webinar on this topic. I'm not sure this will really answer the question, but I'll focus on the confidentiality issue. What you have to remember is that confidentiality is about somebody's human rights. It's about somebody's human right to privacy and dignity and free choice. And so all the decisions that we make about confidentiality, what information we're sharing, where and how we share it, have to start from that point of view. They have to start from the point of view that the confidentiality is about respecting people's rights and protecting people. And that will mean different things in different settings. And I think it's really important to be upfront and explicit about that and not assume things. I think there are opportunities for social workers to use social media more. People often respond better to communication over social media than they do in a face-to-face interview in an office, say. But it's got to be negotiated with all of the people involved. If somebody you're working with is sharing information on social media, don't just assume that it's okay to contact them on social media, or assume that it's okay to discuss things in a certain way on social media just because that person is or because somebody else is. So I think there is a danger that we get too worried about. People do worry rightly about confidentiality, and that might stand in the way of us making the best use of these new technologies as a profession. But there is obviously a risk on the other side that we become too free and easy with the information that we've got, and we end up by harming people and disrespecting people. So confidentiality is about respecting somebody's rights, respecting somebody's dignity, respecting somebody's ability to control who knows what about them, subject to legitimate restrictions, of course. If people are at risk, if a crime's being committed, if other people are being put in danger, and so on, then sometimes we have to go beyond it. But I think that's the starting point, and that, I hope, will guide people through at least some of the challenges and questions that they face in this area. But that's what we hope, and I'm sure in a few years' time we'll be coming back, having a similar event, thinking about all the different ways of communicating that we're now got access to, and thinking, well, does the code cover that? Is it good enough? What do we need to change? So so that depends on feedback from yourself who's asked the question, and from our members. What's it like using social media, doing social work over social media, being a social worker on social media? Is the code the resource that we hope it is, or do we need to go further?
Great. And Martin, I'm going to sign out, but you've got 1 minute to wrap up and say goodbye.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Luke. Thanks for your support. Well, yes, so that we've come to the end of today's event. I personally found it really, really useful and thought-provoking to hear the presentations and the thoughts from Sarah, from Jerry, and from Ruth. I hope you have as well. Obviously, the code will help BASW develop its activities in the future. So those will be reported on our website and in our bulletin as well. which you should be receiving, which BASW members will receive. But we really depend on, we're a membership-led organisation. We depend on feedback. We depend on you, people like yourselves coming to us and saying, this is an emerging issue. I'm not sure the code really covers it. This is something that's happening that you need to think about. So I think that we're now out of time. So I'd just like to thank all our participants again. So Jerry Nasarska, Ruth Allen, Sarah Banks, Luke Gagan. Also particularly to thank Lisa Urquhart and Jane Shears, who are doing all the hard work behind the scenes to keep the show on the road. So thank you all very much, and thank you to all of you who've joined us today, participated today. Thanks very much for your interest, and I hope you find the code to be a useful resource in your practice going forward. Thank you.